We do not know his name. We know only that the year was 500 AD, that he lived on a volcanic island in the middle of Lake Tana, that outside his walls, an empire had decided what humanity was permitted to remember. He was writing the Book of Enoch, the book the world had been told did not exist. There is a war most people have never heard of. It was not fought with armies. It was fought over what humanity was permitted to know. On one side, the Roman Empire, her councils, her philosophers, men who had absorbed the categories of Plato and Aristotle, and who brought that philosophy to the table when they decided which words of God would survive. They did not exclude the Book of Enoch because it lacked authority. They excluded it because its content was philosophically inconvenient. God does not panic. While the councils gathered, something else was already in place: geography, language, covenant identity. 3 walls the Greco-Roman assault would never breach, not because Ethiopia was powerful, but because the God who hid his treasure in the mountains of Africa had built those mountains for exactly this purpose. They did not think of themselves as preservers of civilization. They thought of themselves as monks. Century after century, through the Islamic invasion of Ahmad Gran in the 1530s, through fire, through razed churches, through the silence of a world that had forgotten them, anonymous hands continued to copy the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. The complete 81-book canon Rome had narrowed to 66. They did not copy in defiance. They copied because they believed. In 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon fractured the Christian world. The Western Church called Ethiopia's theology heresy, called it schism. What the Western Church intended as condemnation, God used as protection. A church Rome considers heretical will not be pressured to adopt Rome's canon. Ethiopia kept Enoch. Rome kept Aristotle. In 1947, a shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave above the Dead Sea. Inside, sealed for 2,000 years, 11 manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, written in Aramaic. Predating Christ, scholars compared those Aramaic fragments against the Ge'ez text Ethiopia had been copying for 15 centuries in complete isolation from the Western world. They matched.
Imagine you are a teenage shepherd boy. The year is 1947. You are chasing a stray goat through the cliffs above the Dead Sea, the most desolate, bleached, forgotten shoreline on Earth. You toss a rock into a dark cave to scare the animal out. Instead of a goat, you hear something shatter. You climb inside, and what you find there, in clay jars sealed for 2,000 years, will shake the foundations of history, religion, and science to their core. Because inside those jars is a book the world's most powerful institutions spent 17 centuries trying to erase. Before Moses, before Abraham, before the great flood that reset civilization, there was a man named Enoch, 7 generations from Adam. A figure so mysterious, so singular in all of ancient literature, that the Bible dispenses with his death in a single extraordinary line. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24. No death, no burial, no grave. He simply vanished. But before he vanished, tradition says he left something behind, a book. A record of visions so staggering, so cosmologically precise, so theologically dangerous, that it would be read, venerated, and then systematically suppressed across the span of 2,000 years. The Book of Enoch opens in the heavens. It describes a class of divine beings called the Watchers, sons of God assigned to observe and guide humanity, who made a catastrophic decision. They looked down at the daughters of men, and they wanted what they saw. 200 of them descended onto a mountain called Hermon. They took wives, they had children, enormous hybrid offspring the ancient world called the Nephilim, giants, mighty men of old, men of renown. Genesis 6 records this in 4 sparse, chilling verses. The Book of Enoch gives you the full account, the names of the watchers, their sins, their forbidden teachings to humanity, metallurgy, sorcery, astrology, the secrets of root cutting and enchantment, and then their judgment. God looked at what had been done to his creation, and he responded with a flood. Now, here is where history becomes explosive. The Book of Enoch was not some obscure fringe text forgotten in a dusty corner of antiquity. It was quoted directly by the Apostle Jude in the New Testament. Not as legend, not as folklore, as prophecy, the Apostle Peter appears to reference it. The early church fathers, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, treated it as authoritative scripture in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Tertullian explicitly argued it should be in the canon. So what happened? In 363 AD, the Council of Laodicea began restricting which books could be read in churches. In 397 AD, the Council of Carthage, under the enormous theological weight of Augustine of Hippo, formally closed the Western biblical canon. Enoch was out. The official reasons were 3. First, questions of authorship. Scholars argued the text was compiled too late to be genuinely from Enoch himself. Second, the fallen angel narrative was theologically disruptive. The church was moving toward spiritualizing and allegorizing Genesis 6. A text that named the fallen angels, described their specific sins, and detailed their judgment with unflinching literalism was inconvenient. Third, its cosmology. The Book of Enoch describes a fixed, enclosed earth beneath a solid firmament, with storehouses of wind, snow, and rain, and gates through which the sun and moon travel. This was perfectly consistent with Job, Isaiah, and the Psalms. But it was sharply inconsistent with the Greek philosophy that was flooding into the church from the intellectual world of Rome and Alexandria. And so, men voted. Fallible, politically pressured, philosophically compromised men voted on what God had said. And the Book of Enoch lost the vote. There is a detail the history books almost never tell you. One ancient church, with genuine apostolic roots, simply refused to accept the authority of the Roman councils to define their scripture. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Their canon has 81 books, not 66, not 73, 81. And among those books, preserved faithfully for over 1,500 years, is the complete book of 1st Enoch, written in the ancient Ge'ez language. They never removed it, they never questioned it, they never allegorized it, because it had never left. While Rome was burning texts, while Constantinople was debating councils, while the medieval church was tightening its grip on what Christians could believe, the Ethiopian highlands preserved what the rest of the world was trying to erase. And then, in 1947, the caves of Qumran proved they had been right all along. But the suppression of Enoch was not an accident of history. It was one chapter in a much longer story. A story that begins not at the Council of Carthage, but at a tower, in a land called Shinar, with a man named Nimrod. What happened at Babel was not merely the confusion of language. Ancient sources suggest it was the fountainhead, the origin point, from which all corrupted knowledge systems flowed. Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Rome. a chain of transmission that would carry distorted cosmological truth across 4,000 years of human history. And its consequences are still with us today. Let us return to that cave. 1947, the Dead Sea. A young Bedouin named Mohammed Edadib. What he had stumbled upon was a community called the Essenes, or more precisely, the archaeological remnant of their library. A group of intensely devout Jewish scholars who had withdrawn from the corrupted temple establishment in Jerusalem around 150 BC. They had retreated to the desert. They had copied, and copied, and copied again. And when the Roman legions marched toward Jerusalem in 70 AD, they sealed their most precious texts in clay jars and hid them in the caves above the Dead Sea. For 1,877 years, those jars sat undisturbed. Through the fall of Rome, through the Crusades, through the Reformation, through the Scientific Revolution, through 2 world wars, until a goat went astray, the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. Among the 900-plus manuscripts recovered from 11 caves, scholars found fragments of every Old Testament book except Esther. But they also found something that stunned the academic world. 11 separate manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, 11 copies in the same library. More copies of Enoch than of most canonical Old Testament books. This was not an obscure text to the Qumran community. This was scripture. This was treasured. This was the text they copied with the same reverence they gave the Torah. The manuscripts dated to approximately 200 to 100 BC, written in Aramaic, the language of the ancient Near East, predating the birth of Jesus by over a century. This obliterated one of the central arguments for Enoch's exclusion, that it was a late forgery invented by Christians to retroactively create prophecy. The physical evidence proved otherwise. Enoch was old, ancient, carefully preserved, widely copied. Now here is where it gets extraordinary. Remember the Ethiopian church, the one that never let Enoch go? Their version of the Book of Enoch is written in Ge'ez, the ancient Semitic liturgical language of Ethiopia. A text that had been transmitted, recopied, and chanted in African monasteries for 15 centuries. When scholars compared the Ethiopian Ge'ez text against the Aramaic fragments from Qumran, 2 manuscript traditions separated by thousands of miles, over 1,000 years of history, and utterly different cultural contexts, they matched. Not approximately, not loosely. They matched with the precision that should only exist in a living tradition of faithful transmission. Because that is exactly what both of them were. 2 independent witnesses, preserved on opposite sides of the ancient world, telling the same story in the same words. But there is another dimension to the archaeological evidence that most documentaries never touch. The Book of Enoch does not merely tell stories about angels and giants, it describes the structure of creation itself. In meticulous, almost technical detail, Enoch records what he was shown. A solid dome above the earth, a rakia, a firmament, a beaten-out expanse, through which the sun and moon travel along prescribed paths, through specific gates, at scheduled times. Storehouses of wind, storehouses of snow, storehouses of hail, pillars of heaven, the fixed foundations of the earth. This cosmological picture is not unique to Enoch. It is the same picture drawn in Genesis 1, in Job 38, in Psalm 19, in Isaiah 40. It is he who sitteth upon the circle of the earth, who stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. The same cosmological architecture, consistent, detailed, ancient. And here is what that matters for archaeology. If Enoch were a forgery written by a Greek-educated Jewish scribe in the 2nd century BC, when Greek spherical cosmology was already the dominant intellectual framework, the forger would have used the Greek cosmological model. That's what educated writers of that era did. Instead, the cosmology in Enoch reflects the ancient Semitic, pre-Greek understanding of creation, the cosmology of Moses, of David, of Job. This is evidence of genuine antiquity, not proof of forgery, proof of origin. For Western Christianity, the Book of Enoch had been effectively lost for over 1,000 years, until a Scottish explorer named James Bruce rode into Ethiopia in 1773. Bruce was not a theologian. He was an adventurer, a 6'4" red-headed Scotsman with a passion for exploration and a gift for trouble. He came back from Ethiopia carrying 3 complete manuscripts of 1st Enoch, the first complete copies to reach Western scholarship in over a millennium. In 1821, scholar Richard Lawrence published the first English translation. The reaction from the academic and theological establishment was immediate and dismissive, but they could not make the text disappear again. And 126 years later, a teenage shepherd boy with a stray goat and an excellent throwing arm would prove exactly why they should have paid closer attention. Here is the question that should keep you up at night. How did the scientific worldview of ancient Greece, developed without telescopes, without satellites, without any of the instruments we associate with modern discovery, come to replace the cosmological descriptions found in the oldest texts in human history? The answer begins with a man named Pythagoras. Around 570 BC, Pythagoras was not merely a mathematician. He was the founder of a religious mystery cult, the Pythagorean Brotherhood, whose initiates had traveled to Egypt, absorbed the secret cosmological traditions of the Egyptian mystery schools, and returned to Greece with a new cosmological model. His argument for a spherical Earth was not based on observation. It was based on aesthetics. The sphere, he reasoned, was the most perfect geometric form. Therefore, the Earth must be a sphere. This was philosophy dressed as science, and it would prove to be one of the most consequential intellectual moves in human history. Plato took Pythagoras' spherical Earth and embedded it into a comprehensive philosophical system. But Plato did something even more dangerous. He introduced the idea that the physical, material world is an inferior shadow, a dim reflection of a higher realm of pure abstract forms. This Platonic dualism, the idea that the physical creation is somehow lesser, illusory, or unimportant, became philosophical poison when it entered the church. When church fathers began reading Genesis through Platonic eyes, the literal firmament became a metaphor. The literal foundations of the earth became poetry. The literal storehouses of wind and snow became allegory. God's actual described creation dissolved into philosophical abstraction. And the Book of Enoch, with its precise, technical, stubbornly literal cosmology, became not just inconvenient, but embarrassing. Fast forward to the 16th century. A Catholic cleric named Nicholas Copernicus publishes a revolutionary idea. The sun, not the earth, is at the center of the cosmos. History teaches this as the great triumph of empirical observation over religious dogma. Here is what history usually leaves out. Copernicus did not discover heliocentrism. He revived it from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristarchus, who proposed it 3 centuries before Christ. and Copernicus's motivation was explicitly stated in his own writings. He was a Neoplatonist. He believed the sun, as the most noble body, deserved to occupy the most noble position. This was not a scientific conclusion. It was a philosophical preference. Galileo, Kepler, Newton, brilliant men, genuine mathematical minds, were all deeply embedded in Hermetic, Neoplatonic, and in Newton's case, explicitly occult philosophical traditions. What masqueraded as the triumph of pure observation was, at its roots, the final institutional victory of a philosophical tradition that stretched back to Pythagoras, back to the Egyptian mystery schools, back to Babel. In the 19th century, as Darwinism and Newtonian mechanics were consolidating their hold on Western civilization, a man named Samuel Burley Rowbotham did something radical. He put down the philosophy books, and he looked. On a perfectly straight 6-mile stretch of canal in England, the Bedford level, Rowbotham conducted hundreds of careful, repeatable, documented experiments. He set up targets at measured distances across the water and observed whether they disappeared at the rate demanded by the globe model's curvature mathematics. They did not. His conclusion, published in a book called Zetetic Astronomy, Earth Not a Globe, was simple. Begin with observation, not assumption. Follow where the evidence leads, not where the paradigm demands. He was ridiculed, marginalized, written out of the scientific record. But his experiments were repeatable, and many of them have never been satisfactorily refuted. Here is the most remarkable thing about all of this. Despite every force arrayed against it, church councils, philosophical revolutions, institutional suppression, academic ridicule, the Book of Enoch survived. It survived because of a principle that runs through all of history like a thread of gold. God keeps a remnant. The Qumran community, outnumbered, marginalized, retreating to the desert, copying Enoch by lamplight in clay-floored scriptorium rooms, sealing their work in jars, trusting that someone someday would find it. The Ethiopian church, singing Enoch in their ancient liturgy for 1,500 years, in highland monasteries the Roman councils could never reach. The Waldensian believers, dying in alpine valleys rather than surrender their scripture. Rowbotham on his canal, alone against the entire scientific establishment, and a teenage shepherd with a throwing arm and a wandering goat. The word was not lost, it was waiting. We live in an era of maximum information and maximum confusion. Everything that was suppressed is now accessible. The Dead Sea Scrolls are online. The Ethiopian Bible has been translated into English. The Zetetic experiments of Rowbotham and his contemporaries have been digitized. Ancient texts that spent 2,000 years in the dark are available to anyone with an honest heart and a searching mind. The question is not whether the Book of Enoch exists. The caves answered that in 1947. The question is not whether it was venerated by the Apostolic Church. The New Testament answered that with Jude's direct citation. The question is not whether it aligns with the rest of Scripture. Job, Isaiah, Genesis, and the Psalms speak the same cosmological language. The question is simply this: what do you do with the truth when it finds you? 2,000 years ago, a group of faithful men sealed their most precious manuscripts in clay jars and hid them in the dark. They did not know who would find them. They did not know when. They only knew the word was worth preserving. In 1947, a stone, a crack of breaking clay, a boy's eyes adjusting to darkness, and something ancient breathing again in the light.